Most people in northern Kentucky would never have thought our kids, our friends and neighbors would become dependent on heroin. That's a other people idea. And now it's like, oh, it's happening to my people. When I started at NKU, and really even up to like 5 years ago, I never thought the stuff that I did research on and that I taught would ever be considered locally useful. And then the heroin epidemic blew up.
In my mind, we've really enabled its use, the government, and that's our fault here at the state capitol in Frankfort. 6 years ago, we passed what's called House Bill 463. We took it for very serious penalties for trafficking in heroin to almost no penalties at all. Since that, these last 6 years, we've seen a huge spike in heroin use and a lot of deaths, a lot of overdoses. We also here in Frankfort passed the pill mill legislation, which we made stricter getting prescription drugs, and they were mainly opiate-based. So you had a lot of people who were having trouble getting the prescription drugs. They were addicts, and so they went to heroin. We had a cheap supply of heroin. We weren't penalizing heroin dealers. Hence, we have this huge heroin crisis where hundreds of people are dying of overdoses. It's horrible.
My students and I have focused our research on measuring people's attitudes toward people who use heroin, also looking at attitudes toward the responses that we can make to address the epidemic. So I'm particularly interested in a set of responses that fall under the umbrella of harm reduction.
Harm reduction, which is the philosophy Syringe Exchange is based off of, really helps people learn how to make better choices for themselves.
Let's take people who are having problems with drug use and let's work with them to move them toward less harm. We've also looked at attitudes toward syringe access exchange programs. That's one of the first harm reduction ideas. It's been in practice somewhere in the world since the late 1980s, and yet it's still probably one of the most controversial of all the harm reduction practices.
Our local program works as a one-for-one syringe exchange. So a person brings in one used syringe, we give them one new syringe. Same as 5, they get 5.
Study after study, we consistently find that syringe access exchange programs are the hardest sell. It's especially true when people hold these strong attitudes that say heroin use is your own damn fault. It's, you're the one that chose to do it. It isn't a disease.
A lot of people say, well, use of heroin is a sickness. I disagree with that. Use of heroin is a choice, just like smoking is. We make choices in life, and we have to deal with our choices. And I just think it sends the wrong signal. On one hand, don't do drugs. It's a horrible, bad thing. Don't do heroin. But on the other hand, if you decide to do it, we're going to provide you with a safe way to do it so you don't catch some other disease.
One of the secondary problems with heroin use is the transmission of hepatitis C and HIV.
It's what we call a bloodborne pathogen. In an IV drug user, it's transferred from needle to needle. Our IV drug users have their needles that are theirs and they use them over and over and over and they share them.
But if we can provide clean needles for them, they can at least decrease the risk of having a communicable disease in addition to their addiction.
There's arguments to be made that it would cut down on hepatitis, but there's no legitimate evidence that shows that it cuts down on heroin use. In fact, heroin use is worse than it's ever been. Every year it gets worse.
This syringe access exchange program is not going to solve the heroin problem, and that's not what it is.
It simply lets them do what they're already doing more safely and in a way that helps
decrease the effects for that person and our community of the hepatitis C rate and the tsunami of HIV that could come after that.
It's one thing if somebody out on the road goes out and decides to buy heroin or decides to buy needles. That's a choice they're making with their money. But when you do it as a government program, you're taking people like myself and other people. I know that maybe most students in Northern, favor the needle exchange, but I know several that don't. You're forcing them to participate in that. That's morally wrong.
Syringe access exchange program, this heroin issue, it's a devastating issue. Is this right to do? Is it wrong to do? I've been working in public health for 26 years. I never thought that we would get to this point where that's something that we would be offering, but it's the only public health tool we have. If we had anything else that we could offer to help people not get hepatitis C, we would.